So I actually thought I was not going to be able to make a proper video about this unit. I kept being busy with various things and didn't have much time to test Grave. But in order to complete this unit, let's get right on this. I was waiting a bit if Grave issue in the other video I mentioned was going to be addressed or not, but since it's been a while and they have not done anything even after the patch of fixing Solar Raid, I'll go along with Grave's current behavior in terms of evaluating her and giving tips about her gameplay. Before we start, I would actually want to let you know that this is actually going to be a multi-part video. There are some things I want to talk about Grave, and putting those other things into just one video might detract some of the main takeaways for Grave. If you want to stay up to date and also see the other videos, make sure you're subscribed so that you can see when the new videos come out. Some of you might not be aware that you're not subscribed yet, even though my videos get recommended to you. With that out, let's begin with Grave. First, let's talk about Grave and her identity. On the surface, Grave looks to be an extremely solid Pierce unit buffer. There's been some discussions on who's current best burst 2 buffer right now, and on paper it seems like Grave has some niche. But does she actually match up to take over as the best in her niche? Well, the answer is a bit more nuanced than that. To start with, let's make sure we understand her role in team. Grave is a burst 2 unit that is both a mix of damage and support. In terms of personal damage, depending on various team compositions and who we're comparing her with, Grave can get between 40% up to 80% of damage when compared to another main DPS. Naturally, these numbers are with the evaluation that we build her also like a DPS as well, with proper skill gears, overload invested. In comparison to a traditional support does only about 10 to 20% of personal damage compared to a main DPS. This is thanks to a few factors. 1. Grave's base weapon damage multiplier is a bit higher compared to a traditional assault rifle support. 2. Grave's skill 2 and burst provides buff for her own damage. She can get pierce herself and can get up to 100% critical rate thanks to her burst, and thus allowing Grave to deal more damage compared to a traditional support. But personal damage aside, how about Grave's support capability? Well, Grave has 3 things that make her a noteworthy support in the top level. To start with, Grave's burst has 2 parts in it as a support buff. First is the attack damage buff that is boasting a 48.2% attack damage buff for 10 seconds. This value is higher compared to most burst 2 supports, and for any unit that doesn't have any personal attack damage multiplier on their own buffs, this buff is a straight up extra damage multiplier to their damage. The receiver doesn't have to be a pierce damage user to receive such buff and benefit from it. The second part of her burst buff is pierce damage, which is as straightforward as it is. Any unit that has pierce effect on their attacks will get bonus damage. There's also a bonus max ammo capacity that gives 3 extra rounds, which is a nice bonus but not much of a big deciding factor in her team building. And finally, another factor on her support identity lies on her skill 1. In particular, the one you should pay attention to is her burst gauge filling speed buff. A lot of people might not care about this as much and flew by everyone's radar, but this skill is actually impactful for the topmost level players. To begin with this skill, let's start breaking down Nikke's burst count per fight. Starting off with a team with no cooldown reduction, teams with this such composition do 9 full burst rotations in a 3-minute fight. Most commonly, people will notice this on shotgun teams that typically don't bring any cooldown reduction unit. Moving on to the next cooldown reduction tier, burst 2 cooldown reduction unit like Dala and Summer Helm has a scaling cooldown that goes with the first burst cooldown of only 1.82 seconds, but the next burst after that is 4.02 seconds, and then all the bursts after the third one is at 6.62 seconds. For this cooldown reduction, an optimal burst generation with this team is typically sitting at 12.6 full burst rotations. The next one is the burst 1 cooldown reduction, which has 2 main variation and then Dorothy's variation and also Sakura's variation. In the situation of Dorothy, you can get a solid 12.8 to 13 full burst rotations. It can vary a little bit, but she has a limit on how much cooldown reduction she can provide due to her only being able to shoot so many times per second and relying on max ammo reduction unit. Meanwhile, one of the variation in the burst 1 category is the full charge variation with the Killer Wife and Rouge. With their variation, they can consistently have a burst cooldown reduction of at least 7 seconds. You can get up to 13.7 full burst rotation, where you have 13 full burst and another one with 7 seconds on the last one. But for the one that I want to go a bit in detail is on the main variation of burst 1, which is the variation of litter and volume. Litter and volume is similar to Dala and Summer Helm that has also scaling cooldown reduction. However, their values are higher, starting with 2.34 seconds for the first burst, and then from the third burst onwards they have 8.21 seconds. You see, under basic optimization circumstances, litter's variation can get around 13.4 full burst rotations. There's about 13 full burst rotations of full 10 seconds and then a 14th one with just 4 seconds left. Even though litter's variation of 8.21 seconds reduction on cooldown is technically more than the Killer Wife's variation of only 7 seconds, litter's variation has a few issues. 1. Litter's second and third burst has a delay due to the scaling cooldown reduction. 2. Even though litter has an 8.21 seconds of cooldown reduction, in many circumstances, players cannot have enough burst generation to catch that cooldown. Considering that a full burst lasts for 10 seconds, that means we have 1.79 seconds to burst energy generate back up to take advantage of litter's cooldown reduction. Accomplishing this feat is very difficult to achieve, especially in a boss situation where there's so many things happening at once. And so even though litter's cooldown reduction variation has a better amount, majority of the players cannot take advantage of it just simply because they don't have enough energy generation. There are some scenarios where if the boss permits to have a pierce or AoE conditions for energy gain, then you can optimize the energy gain to reach up to 14 full bursts. One example of it was in the Land Eater solo raid where top players were able to min-max and get 14 full bursts with a team that consisted of Crown, Litter, Alice, Scarlet Black Shadow, and Privity. But the issue in this is it was conditional to this boss and was only achievable because we were able to have both core shots and also pierce at the same time, allowing players to have an extremely good burst energy generation. Now you are probably seeing where I'm going at here. With Graves' bonus on energy generation, players that are min-maxing their movements can now achieve 14 full bursts a lot more easier without relying on boss conditions as much. So why does this matter? Why does having that extra 6 seconds on full burst such a big deal? Well, at the end of the day, that's on you as a player. The competitive scene in solo raid goes in a lot of lengths for those extra seconds of burst. For top players, that 6 seconds of full burst is already worth 100 to 200 mil points. This is just putting it to perspective in the eyes of the people that are planning to min-max in the game. Building on top of what we just talked about, here are my recommendations for Graves skills. The skill 1 damage increase is varying depending on the team composition or the type of player you are. From level 1 to level 7, you could be only getting 1 to 5% damage increase as a casual player, but a competitive player could see up to about 10% total damage increase depending if they can take advantage of the burst generation due to being able to have more burst uptime. For casual players, I would just keep skill 1 at the value of 4 as you're not going to be able to take advantage of its benefits that much. If you also just plan to use Grave for campaign or non-competitive content, keeping it at level 4 is also just fine. Grave's advantage on energy burst gain starts seeing difference on units like Litter or Volume, which can reduce burst cooldown by 8 seconds. But this only happens on the 4th full burst onwards when their cooldown reduction have started ramping up. Campaign, simulation, and tower fights are typically shorter in duration, and they also tend to have AoE and pierce scenarios that makes Graves' bonus to energy generation not as necessary. So the biggest value on skill 1 is typically on boss scenarios. For competitive players, then getting the skill 1 to level 7 or level 10 would then be recommended. Typically, how to go about this to determine if you feel like you have enough skill level is how often you can catch Litter's burst on cooldown still, starting from the 4th burst onwards. If you don't see Litter's burst on cooldown by the time you have enough energy gain to do another full burst, then it's worth to upgrade it more. Skill 2 on particular note is just Graves' personal damage. Upgrading this doesn't increase too much of the total damage as it ranges between 1 to 5% only from level 1 to level 7 on Graves' own damage. Do note that this is just the personal damage and not the total damage, which is why this skill is on a low priority. Finally, for burst, this is Graves' bread and butter. This is the biggest reason why to use her. From level 1 to level 7, Graves' personal DPS increased by about 20 to 30% and the team-wide damage increased by about 10 to 15%. Max this out when planning to use her. Overall, the skill recommendation for Grave is the casual budget at 447, competitive budget at 7-4, and then the burst would be around 7 to 10, and then competitive would be 10-4-10, with the whales and competitive at 10-10-10. In terms of overloads, it's as straightforward as it gets in terms of building Grave. 4 times attack, 4 times elemental, and 4 times critical damage. The other stats aren't as necessary or impactful to her. There's some arguments to be had for some people about hit rate, but something to realize is critical bonus is additive to core hit bonus, and on top of that, Grave's best use is for piercing. And in many boss situations, pierce conditions and core hit conditions don't match up, and typically it's better to just have more guaranteed damage, which is the increase on critical damage, rather than the hit rate, which at many times won't translate to bonus damage to some bosses. In terms of cube, for most people's situation, it would be your highest leveled cube for more stats or elemental bonus. But there's actually a more complicated answer to this, and it's actually pertaining to the min-maxers that would want to manual play. If you're using litter or volume as a cooldown reduction, then resilience is actually an option for Grave. I would just keep this in the back of your mind for now, and if you're interested to see why, I would wait for the next video where I will go more in detail on this. Regarding doll priority, Grave sits between low and medium priority. She's not going to take advantage much of the core shot bonus from doll bonus due to how we're going to be building her and her typical use case. She does decent enough damage, but she's not like she's a top tier in terms of personal main DPS damage. Having more shots also don't increase her buffs, so as a support, it's not providing much. Let's now talk about units and teams for Grave. Grave as a buffer is actually very flexible. Although it might seem like she's supposed to be for units with Pierce, her support is good enough even to non-Pierce units. In the most basic setup, Litter and the Killer Wife supposedly are units for her Burst 1. More specifically though, Litter is the better option and would result in more damage, and we can also take advantage of the cooldown reduction advantage. When using Grave, we won't have any other attack buff source, which is why an attack buffer benefits the team. Litter fits the bill on attack buff and cooldown reduction. The Killer Wife meanwhile has a synergy of Pierce and Fire Element typing, which would benefit if there are other Fire type buffers like Asuka or Ray from the collab. For campaign use, Grave's primarily good to utilize if you don't have Crown in your team. Crown plus Naga combo is still very strong in campaign due to how many enemies have core in them. But in the chance that you don't have Crown, you can then use Grave instead as a substitute and then replace Naga with another DPS or buffer that fits the team. On top of that, in Anomaly Interception for Indivilia, Litter might not necessarily survive due to increased damage of Indivilia against iron units, and Indivilia has a huge unavoidable AoE that hits the whole team on phase 2. There are ways to keep Litter alive, but it's difficult for majority of the players as Litter is uninvested and people are more likely to opt in with the Killer Wife instead. In a one-team elemental content also like Anomaly Interception, you can even end up using Crown as a side buffer as well. You could end up using the Killer Wife, Grave, Alice, Asuka, and Crown, which takes advantage of elemental damage and pierce properties of the team. Naturally, this isn't the only team to build Grave on. In a team with multiple teams content, Grave's role does switch a bit. Her biggest role of Pierce buffer may not necessarily be what people would end up going for, but instead as the second highest attack damage buffer. Taking a look at the team's last solo raid, you'll notice that Grave became a buffer for Cinderella instead. Some people have decided to opt in for this combination due to splitting the top elemental DPS between Crown and Grave. And due to synergy of Rouge and Red Hood as Burst 1 buffers with Cinderella, and how we had to split units into different teams, people have ended up using Rouge instead with Grave in this scenario, and people have decided to use the Killer Wife, which is supposedly for Pierce, as just a cooldown reduction for the Crown team. So if anything, the simplest way to think of using Grave is not to focus too much on her Pierce buffs. At the very least, that is for now with the current units out. This may change later down the road as we get more Pierce units to pass around in the future, but at the moment, Grave does exist as a flexible burst 2 buffer. This means that we can slot her in any team and she'll function just fine. One thing to keep in mind in terms of multiple team content, primarily solo raid and union raid, is that she would shine the best with units that don't have attack damage self buffs, so that's something to consider as well. So, what are my thoughts on Grave? Grave is currently a really strong buffer for Pierce for sure. However, the current units we have right now have restrictions. With the bigger and bigger prioritization on elemental meta, she'll be relegated as a second best buffer for the second team with the strongest element if that element doesn't have strong pierce units. Iron and fire have some units that can very well take advantage of Grave's buffs, so I could see them having Grave in the strongest team combo. Unless the boss has core, in which case Crown and Naga combo against Grave is going to be a tough comparison, and both combinations can contest each other for it. One other factor to make sure to not overlook is Grave's contribution to damage. Her damage can go between 40 to 80% of a main DPS depending on the team composition or how invested she has been set up as. If you have spare resources, then investing on her as a DPS is not bad. In the simplest form of building Grave, she is not complicated. Her burst is the highest priority and skill 1 is for energy gain. Meanwhile, skill 2 can be low priority and we can cheap out on her. On top of that, her overload isn't complicated as well with attack, elemental, and critical damage as just the priority. And finally, her energy burst gain buff is excellent for people that want to push boundaries of damage in solo raid. Overall, should you pull for Grave? For many people wanting to be competitive in solo raid, Grave is a recommended pull unit. There's plenty of flexibility and future team building with Grave that she'll have an effect, especially once we get more pierce units. On top of that, she's a pilgrim, so now is the best chance to get her. As more and more pilgrims get into the pool of units, it'll be more difficult to get a particular unit. If you want to future-proof your account for flexible competitive team building, you should at least get a copy of her. Now for people who are casual, I wouldn't say she's an extreme must, especially if you have Crown already. To a certain extent, she could end up being just a side grade to Crown. There's alternatives if you also don't have Grave, so it's not the end of the world if you don't have her. But just keep in mind that if you don't have her, you may end up being a lower tier performance comparatively in terms of competitive rankings. With that being said, is having duplicates good for Grave? No, not really. Grave's damage ceiling has some clear limitations when you compare her with an actual DPS. Getting duplicates of Grave doesn't increase her buff like other support units, but it's more increasing just her personal damage. But since Grave's personal damage isn't also top tier because of her being in the middle of both DPS and support, duplicates of Grave isn't as worth compared to, say, investing in other top tier DPS. I do see competitive whales going for duplicates though of her, but that's the main extent I could see who I think would be fine on getting duplicates of her. So to close things off, well, this isn't exactly the final part of the guide. Up next, I'll be talking more things about Grave's mechanics. I wanted this first video out though to encapsulate the general idea about Grave and for most people's general use. It took me a while to make this video as I've been working on many different things alongside and keeping up with my streaming schedule, which by the way, you should definitely come over and come hang out. We've been going really well and there's lots of you that stop by and hang out. I will answer any question that people want about the game, and so come hang out with all the other commanders. Come and follow me at Twitch, twitch.tv/KaiJLV, and that's it for me, and I'll see you guys next time. By the way, did you know that 56% of you still hasn't subscribed yet? Make sure to click that subscribe button, click that bell notification, leave a comment, like, and subscribe.